No, I'm just standing here. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's pretty great, right? Yeah. But you can also like clip it on. It just, yeah.
Far away, and that will be the case.
Do I sit? Yeah. Didn't you hear me? No, I think I didn't freak out about it because you were freaked out about Olsen. So I was like, I will leave it aside. Yeah. What if he finds one? I think it's okay that I stand when he introduces me, right? That's what Aisha did. Yeah. That's what? Okay, good.
I'll eat my cookie really fast.
Yeah, Annika also, right? She did like a grief observed. I think he also. They were both doing grief. Yeah.
It was great. It's over. Don't look at it. Except to like.
Well, everybody's quiet, so. Good morning, and welcome to Davidson's oration. Do you believe in magic? Lewis's Re-enchantment of Reality. It shocked me when my son was in second grade at public school in Avon, Connecticut, that he came home with a book to read, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Do these people know what this book is about? Very surprising. And whether you know what the book is about or not, the story is compelling. The whole genre is compelling, of fairy stories and worlds that are different worlds that are parallel to our world. And so when Gemma said she wanted to work on C.S. Lewis and talk about fairy stories, I was all for it. It's just a great topic. How do fairy stories fit into the way we look at the world? How do they change the way we look at the world? And what did C.S. Lewis know that other people didn't? And it's been a real pleasure to work with Gemma. We've had wonderful discussions about Lewis, going beyond the question of fairy stories, so over coffee at Lincoln Street Bakery. And it's my pleasure to present her to you.
Thank you, Dr. Tonkowicz, for that introduction and for the many hours of advice, enthusiasm, and coffee you have poured into this project. Thank you, Dr. Zepeda, for being my second reader, and for the many semesters of philosophy and science that you pulled my class through with the patience of a saint. Hopefully, these orations have been a nice change of pace. Thank you, Dr. Olsen, for being my third panelist. I am excited and slightly intimidated to find you here, but I hope when all said and done, you have a lovely time of it. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Our Lady, Star of the Sea. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I grew up in suburban Denver. The wider world was characterized by gray streets, square buildings, and strangers who never really bothered to make eye contact. There was something empty and unpleasant about that world. But then I discovered fairy tales. In fairy tales, everything was different. Things were wonderful, intense. There were dangers and then there was victories. There were the princess, and there was the knight defeating the dragon. And so today, I would particularly like to talk about the wider fantasy genre, but particularly fairy tales, as being capable of bringing us to a greater self-knowledge, which eventually brings us to a greater knowledge of our final end, that being our relationship with God. Now, the quote that started the catalyst for my thesis and what I would like to start this oration with is a quote from C.S. Lewis. This quote isn't even in the Chronicles of Narnia proper, nor is it from one of his essays. It's from the dedication at the beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to his goddaughter, in which he says, quote, "Someday you'll be old enough to read fairy tales again," end quote. Now, this idea was not just incredibly enticing to me because of how much I loved fairy tales and how I wanted to believe that somehow I could take them with me forever, but also because it spoke of a deeper idea. The idea that you weren't just constantly trying to perfect yourself and abandoning old objects to your past, that somehow the first experience you had with a good thing could be brought back into your present for you to experience all over again. Now, some accused Lewis of being a rather childish in this mentality, but we'll wave away that kind of simplistic insult because Lewis is pointing specifically to the fact that somehow you have to grow up in order to reclaim your experience with fairy tales. Well, what about escapism then? The idea that you're somehow trying to leave behind the world in which you live in order to go to a nicer world, one where things are more pleasant, maybe even cooler, more exciting. Such a critique is kind of being leveled against Lewis by his contemporary, Mr. John Wayne. No relation. He said, recalling a conversation he had with Lewis, quote, "Once, unable to keep silence at what seemed to me a monstrous partiality, I attacked the whole basis of his view. A writer's task, I maintained, was to lay bare the human heart, and this could not be done if he were continually taking refuge in the spinning of fanciful webs." Lewis retorted with a theory that, since the creator had seen fit to build a universe and set it into motion, it was the duty of the human artist to create as lavishly as possible in his own turn. The romancer who invents a whole world is worshiping God more effectively than the mere realist who analyzes that which lies about him, end quote. Now, here, Mr. Wayne is contrasting two ideas, a kind of realism with Lewis's romanticism. In the realism, the importance lies in focusing on the world as you experience it. But Lewis is pointing to an idea that somehow the romantic is trying to give you something beyond the world of your daily experience. And not only that, that somehow the reaching into this other world is more effectively a response to the reality in which you live, to the reality of God as creator. But in order to explore more deeply what Lewis is doing here, we need to understand more particularly what Lewis thinks the fantastic and mythic mode is. Quote, "The fantastic or mythical is a mode. At every age, it has the same power to generalize while remaining concrete, to present in palpable forms, not concepts or even experiences, but whole classes of experience, and to throw off irrelevancies. But at its best, it can do more. It can give us experiences we have never had, and thus, instead of commenting on life, can add to it," end quote. Now, Lewis is pointing here to the generalization while giving concrete examples. We can see this in the generic fairy tale, the idea that it's not important when or exactly where fairy tales happen, only that they happen once upon a time in a land far away. But they're not just giving you abstract ideas, they're giving you concrete realities to consider. They're giving you the princess, they're giving you the knight, they're giving you the dragon, and many other colorful characters. And what Lewis is pointing to as the purpose of the fairy tale is to give you a class of experience. You go through the story with the characters in their coming upon obstacles, in their overcoming the obstacles, in them attaining their happy ending for the most part. And they do give you this class of experiences while throwing off irrelevancies. And by irrelevancies, I mean the details that I guess you could add, but wouldn't actually give you more of the experience. For instance, you could you could contemplate the fact that Cinderella probably really got impatient with her family sometimes, or that maybe her stepmother actually had a really troubled childhood. But those details are irrelevant to the experience that the fairy tale is trying to lead you through. And then, of course, there's the fact that it can give you experiences you have never had. Now, you can kind of think of this in the way that, well, obviously you've never, at least to my knowledge, probably come across a knight in shining white armor on the street. And so the fairy tale is somehow welcoming you into that experience, your ability to interact with a world with a kind of fullness of reality in and of itself. And somehow, by interacting with that world, it can add to your experience in your own. Now, Lewis had a very pivotal experience with fantasy. I'll qualify that with the idea that Lewis already had a great taste for fantasy in his earlier life. He grew up loving the Norse mythology, and then he even matured into reading the great romanticists of the classical eras. But for Lewis, his view on fantasy most changed when he came in contact with George MacDonald. Now, at a little train stop, Lewis picked up a book called Phantastes, a fairy romance. And in contemplating this book in his autobiographical work, Surprised by Joy, he says, quote, "The woodland journeyings in the story were close enough to my habitual imagery to lure me on without the perception of a change. For in one sense, the new country was exactly like the old. I did not yet know, and I was long in learning, the name of the new quality, the bright shadow that rested on the travels of Adonis. I now perceived that while the air of the new region made all my erotic and magical perversions of joy look like sordid trumpery, it had no such disenchanting power over the bread upon the table or the coals in the grate. But now I saw the bright shadow coming out of the book into the real world and resting there, transforming all common things and yet itself unchanged. In the depth of my disgraces, in the then invincible ignorance of my intellect, all this was given me without asking, even without consent. That night, my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized," end quote. So Lewis is pointing to the fact that this new experience he has with this bright shadow is integral to what will change his view of the fantasy genre itself. Now, the bright shadow Lewis will go on later to contemplate as a kind of holy providence. This will relate directly into Lewis's eventual full reconversion to Christianity, in which he recognizes that holy providence as specifically directing him towards God. But for here, it is just noteworthy that he does not think of himself as having had an experience with this holy providence before he comes in contact with it through George MacDonald's story. Now, this bright shadow changes two things in Lewis's perspective. He changes Lewis's erotic and magical perversions of joy. And secondly, somehow the bright shadow, though he has accessed it through the story, comes out of the story into Lewis's world, the world of bread and coal. So we'll focus on the first part, the changing of Lewis's perceptions of joy. Now, I won't go into joy proper, but rather I will say that for Lewis, joy is merely one of the most intense variety of desire that you can have. Now, Lewis has an entire essay in which he explores the kind of progression and cycle that he sees in our human desire. This is his essay talking about bicycles, in which Lewis imagines a conversation between himself and a friend. Quote, "I can remember a time in early childhood when a bicycle meant nothing to me. It was just part of the huge, meaningless background of grown-up gadgets against which life went on. Then came a time when to have a bicycle and to have learned to ride it, and to be at last spinning along on one's own early in the morning under trees, in and out of the shadows, was like entering paradise. Now one could begin to be happy. But of course, I soon reached the third period. Pedaling to and fro from school, it was one of those journeys that feel uphill both ways. In all weathers, soon revealed the pros of cycling. The bicycle itself became to me what his oar is to a galley slave," end quote. So what we see here are 3 of the 4 stages of enchantment. The first being unenchantment, the second, enchantment, the third, disenchantment. We'll go into the 4th later. For now, we see that unenchantment is characterized by a lack of experience with the enchanting object, in this case, the bicycle. The second stage, enchantment, comes with an experience and then a desire for this enchanted object. The third, disenchantment, is characterized by disappointment. For whatever reason, the bicycle can't actually give you everything you thought it was going to. And soon it becomes something more of a burden, something more of an unpleasantness with which you have to interact. Now, to take fairy tales in particular, using these first 3 stages, obviously the first, unenchantment, you haven't actually read a fairy tale. You've never actually experienced it or heard it read to you. You've never really come in contact with the realities it's trying to portray to you. But then enchantment strikes. You open up your first fairy tale and you read it, and all of a sudden, ideas you never even thought of come out to you. And you imagine living in a world like that, a world where there's color and intensity and beauty, unlike anything you found on Earth. But then disenchantment comes. Now, with fairy tales, we actually see this in a very cliche way, because most of the time you enter the fairy tales expecting to find everything that you want. But then through your growing up, you come in contact with the wider world and you learn that you have to have good grades and that you have to make money and that you have to have a plan for the future. And those things aren't really what the fairy tale is concerned with telling you how to do. So all of a sudden, you find your loyalty divided. And for most of us, we understand that we can't actually live the fairy tale life. So that shows that there are 2 ways with which you can take the cycle of disenchantment. You can either, like the Madame Bovary of the world or the Don Quixote, instead enmesh yourself within the enchantment all over again and strive after it, even though you know that in some way it seemed to let you down. Or you can just sink headfirst into disenchantment, and you can begin to see that whatever enchantment was promising you, it was lying. It was an empty thing, an illusion with which you distracted yourself for a while, but now you've grown up and you can feel pretty good about leaving it behind you. But Lewis finds a 3rd way to react to this stage of disenchantment. Instead of thinking that what he desired was wrong, he instead begins to change the way he was looking at his desire. And here he takes a very basic Aristotelian principle, the idea that if you have a desire, there must somehow be an object for it. Lewis, further into the essay, compares the stage of enchantment to waving a carrot in front of a donkey's nose. Now, this is to suggest a kind of trick, a kind of meanness about the enchantment. The idea that you're trying to promise the donkey something it can't actually attain. But then Lewis's friend pushes back. And he says, well, maybe they can't get the carrot. But what if there was something in the scent of the carrot that seemed to awaken in the donkey something more, something it almost appreciated more than ever actually eating the carrot would give it? Now, we can all be very sure that this is not actually what happens when a donkey smells a carrot. Because for the donkey, as soon as it smells the carrot and gets the carrot, it's set. Its desire was awakened and then satisfied, and it looks no further. But Lewis is pointing here to a curious thing about ourselves. If we get the scent of the carrot, it could actually awaken more than just a desire that only the carrot could satisfy. For instance, when riding the bicycle, Lewis is recalled an idea of somehow attaining to a paradisal state. Somehow now you could begin to be happy just because of the bicycle. But when you look at the bicycle, it's just a framework of metal with 2 wheels. How in the world is it supposed to offer you paradise? But this is the idea that Lewis is going to dig deeper into. He asks himself, well, if there's a desire that this bike has given me, or in my case, that the fairy tale has given me, which the fairy tale or the bike itself cannot fully satisfy, then somehow this object of enchantment has brought me in contact with something else that my desire is actually reaching for. Lewis will go on in Mere Christianity to realize that if he has a desire that nothing in this world can fully satisfy, then he must look somewhere else for the answer. Quote, "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they were only a kind of copy or echo or mirage." End quote. What Lewis is pointing to here is the idea that in understanding our desire more completely and understanding what's at the basis of our desire for any of these objects of enchantment in the world around us, we can instead bring greater clarity to our pursuit of our object. For Lewis, he points to the fact that if nothing in this world can satisfy it, then he was meant for another world. Now, we can, of course, see in here the exact idea that we are not meant for earth, but rather we are meant for heaven. We are meant for the perfect communion with God himself. So what I can recognize here in my enchantment with fairy tales is that fairy tales, well, they did, yes, give me ideas of princesses, knights, and dragons, and those were all very cool. That I was also accessing something deeper within myself, a kind of desire that was not settled upon any of those concrete realities in the fairy tale, but rather something else that the fairy tale was presenting to me. If you dig deeper into what fairy tales are actually offering you, they're offering ideas of beauty, ideas of inherent goodness, the idea that good triumphs over evil in the end. And those are things which the actual concrete realities of the fairy tale cannot actually satisfy you with, because you can't just bring knights and princesses and dragons into this world and think that that's going to give you everything that you want. We know that it won't. Lewis is pointing to this fact. But what the fairy tale has done is bring you in greater contact and understanding of where your desire is trying to lead you. And showing that you can have a desire for another world, Lewis is also pointing to the fact that you may be meant for one. So now that we can see more clearly what these objects of enchantment are leading us towards, not themselves per se, but rather the thing for which they are a kind of copy or echo or mirage, Lewis can go to the fourth stage of enchantment. In quote 8, he says, "When you look back at that first mirage, perfectly aware that it was a mirage, and yet seeing all the things that have come out of it, and feeling also that to remember it is, in a sense, to bring it back in reality, so that under all the other experiences, it is still there, and that nothing would have happened at all without it, so that even where it was least true, it was telling you important truths in the only form you would then understand." End quote. Now, so we see here that re-enchantment is not characterized by an addition, something that had to be added to the world in order for you to love it again, to be re-enchanted with it, but rather that the change takes place in yourself, that you are now more clearly seeing the object of enchantment, not as the pivotal thing on which all your satisfaction depended, but on something that was intent on bringing you into the future, bringing you to a greater experience. And this, in Lewis's view, is a reason why we can't look with disgust and disappointment upon the world for not being able to satisfy us, but rather it is elevated because we recognize that without this perhaps lower experience in the world, our first experience with riding a bike or our first experience with reading fairy tales, we could not actually have seen all the things they were pointing us towards. And so it would be in a way disloyal to reject them for what they never were actually trying to tell you. Now, in The Weight of Glory, Lewis has another musings upon these objects with which we sometimes try to place all of our satisfaction and happiness in this world. He says, quote, "The objects in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them. If they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. They are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. End quote. So I began this oration with the quote, "Someday you'll be old enough to read fairy tales again." And perhaps it's already very easy to see that this idea is inherent in the idea of re-enchantment. That what Lewis is telling his goddaughter is in a way telling her that she can become re-enchanted with her fairy tales again. But what Lewis points to in this quote is the idea that when we chase these objects as the good, as a thing that will give us paradise, that we're not actually listening to them. We're not actually seeing the truth of what they're trying to offer us. But we can, like Madame Bovary, reject the fact that they're trying to point us towards something else and instead say, no, you are the only thing that I will accept as giving me happiness. Or you can do the disenchantment thing, where you say, I guess you weren't trying to tell me anything at all. Either way, these things will become dumb idols if you pursue them in these ways. They will stop speaking to you of that greater truth of which they have some kind of participation. Instead of seeing that the scent, the echo, and the news are things pointing us necessarily towards something else, we will begin to ignore them altogether. So here we see that when Lewis brings the idea of spells in, he sees that the stage of enchantment can either be a spell for good or a spell for evil. The enchantment, if it can draw you out of your expectations of this life, the idea that your entire satisfaction is somehow found here, it can break you out. Or if you commit yourself to the idea that this life is all there is, whether because the object of enchantment will be the only thing that can give you happiness, or because you think that there's actually no enchantment involved at all, then you will be captured and enmeshed in this world. And this spell will have failed. Now, I would like to take this moment to transition to a scene, my favorite scene, from the Chronicles of Narnia. In the Silver Chair, the Emerald Witch has gathered all the heroes into a room. Now, the Emerald Witch has a huge underground cavern in which she lives. And she is trying to convince the heroes that the world they have experienced before going underground is not real. They can't prove it to her. When they try desperately to explain to her what the sun is, what Aslan is, the witch instead says, "You're children playing games. That lamp, that sun that you think you saw is actually just an exaggerated lamp. Aslan himself is nothing but a big cat." And she consoles them with the idea that now that they can see truly what reality is, her world, her underground world, that they can begin to live happily. But Puddleglum the Marshwiggle stands up to defeat the witch. He does this first by sticking his foot in the fire and causing a horrible stench. But his second attack are these words, quote, "Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all these things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that, in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones," end quote. Now, what's being pointed to here for Lewis is the fact that, in many ways, this world tries to be the underground lair of the Emerald Witch. It tries to convince us that all the things that we have reached for, our ideals, the hopes that we have for the future, a kind of paradisal state, are actually just us playing games. And we need to focus our attention on the work that really has to be done here. But even more importantly than that, though Puddleglum's response is, well, if this is all there is, I want that world, it's not because he actually believes Aslan doesn't exist. He just knows that he can't convince the witch to think that that's important. So he's not going to try to argue. He's just going to be steadfast in his pursuit of Aslan above all else. But what the witch is doing here is that she wants to separate these two worlds. She wants to say, you can either live in my underground lair where things are unclear, you can't see the sky, you don't know where Aslan is. Or you can be babies, playing in that world of ideals, where life is beautiful and where you want to return to someday. But it is this idea of the necessary separation of those two realms that Lewis is committed in so many of his essays and in the Chronicles of Narnia to ending. Because for Lewis, Narnia is there not as an essential escape forever from this world, but it is a place where all the children in his stories go, so that in a way, they can grow up. Because like the Pevensies throughout several of the books, they grow to become the kings and queens of Narnia. They know this world perfectly. But Aslan always sends them back. Now, this is not just because Lewis is actually trying to say that the children have to grow up and leave behind fantasy forever. But it has a much more subtle, consoling message. When Lucy, at the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, begins to weep because Aslan has told her she cannot return to Narnia again, he says that she will find him there. Quote, "But there I have another name." End quote. What Lewis is pointing us to in his stories is the idea that even though it can seem as if this realm of fantasy, this realm of ideals, this realm of new experiences is entirely divorced from our world, the world where things are complicated, confused, and often unpleasant, that this is not inherent within these two worlds, but rather that there is something in the fantasy realm that is supposed to bring you back, most essentially, to this world. As we have seen with his cycle, his stages of re-enchantment, he sees that we must experience this world and in some ways be transported into another, perhaps mistakenly, by thinking that the enchanted object is going to give us everything we thought we wanted. But then we must return, and we must look at what's really going on. Lewis does not believe that these two worlds are essentially divorced. And now, to bring this point home and exactly why he thinks that, I'm going to go to a quote by G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was writing on George MacDonald, and he said, quote, "The commonplace allegory takes what it regards as the commonplaces or conventions necessary to ordinary men and women, and tries to make them pleasant or picturesque by dressing them up as princesses or goblins or good fairies. But George MacDonald did really believe that people were princesses and goblins and good fairies, and he dressed them up as ordinary men and women. The fairy tale was the inside of the ordinary story and not the outside." End quote. So we see here that the way that George MacDonald is supposed to view the world is that he came in contact with the realities that he wrote about most distinctly here. He saw the men and women he came in contact with as the real princesses and the goblins and the good fairies that he then put into his story. In this same way, when George MacDonald puts that bright shadow into Phantastes for Lewis to meet, he does not do that because he thinks that the bright shadow is not here, but rather because he knows most essentially the bright shadow, that holy providence, is more at work here. And so he can transport it into his story with greater clarity. Lewis is now given that same experience. He sees the bright shadow coming out of the story, and he begins to see it in his world of bread and coal. And now that he knows, because he has looked more deeply into his desire and where it is leading him, he knows that more than anything, he wants to find that bright shadow here as well. With his contact with George MacDonald, Lewis's way of seeing the world has changed. He knows what he is looking for, and he has begun to know what it might look like. This is what allows him to say, towards the end of The Weight of Glory, that it is, quote, "a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, If you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, end quote. So now Lewis has been able to find the deeper reality that he was searching for right in front of him. He has been able to see that even though he went looking for gods and goddesses in other worlds, he now has the ability to find them here. So Lewis has actually just been exploring 2 sentences that Christ gives in the gospel. In the scene where in the Gospel of John, where John the Baptist's disciples go to Jesus, the first thing he asks them is, "What do you seek?" This is not, of course, because Christ does not know that he is the ultimate answer to all of their desires, but rather because that is the question he wants them and us to ask ourselves, as Lewis has asked when he has come in the face of disenchantment, a disappointment with the world for what it seems to be unable to offer you. Then, once we have asked what we are seeking and see that we are such complex and interesting creatures that we demand nothing less than an infinite answer himself, then Christ gives the second part of the puzzle. He says, "Come and see." He does not direct your attention to the fact that what you are looking for must necessarily be outside of this world, but instead refocuses your attention on the life you are living. Come and see. Come and follow me. Come and experience this world, because it is there that you will find me. So I really believe that when when C.S. Lewis told his goddaughter that someday she'd be old enough to read fairy tales again, what he was more essentially trying to say is that one day she would wake up and find herself living in one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. We'll start with questions from the panel. Gentlemen?
Thank you very much. I was thinking about what fairy tales do, and they give us new experiences. Can you just say again, why is it that it's so helpful to have the sorts of experiences that you can have in Narnia versus the kind of experiences you could have in, Dostoevsky's Russia, Jane Austen's England? Why go to a made-up place? What exactly does it do?
Well, it's also very interesting there, particularly with the idea of Dostoevsky, because Dostoevsky himself was incredibly entrenched in the folklore of his time. And I feel like a lot of those elements also come out into his stories. But particularly in thinking of like something as complex as a Russian novel and why you can't really have the same experiences there, is because I think that points to the fact that when we live in this world and we gain any experience here, the more realistic the world conveyed to us in the story is, the more we have predisposed judgments, the more that we can't actually experience the thing as it's kind of trying to be given to us, because we already have the ideas of what this world is supposed to look like, how this world works. But when you take it into the fantasy realm, the first thing that you have to basically give the reader is that this isn't the way your world works. That's just what you're getting into when you come here. So they can kind of, in a way, let go of all their presuppositions about how life works and instead enmesh themselves into a world where they really think they're playing by that world's rules, in the same way that they think a Russian novel is playing by our world's rules. And so there they can experience something new because they're not really focused on what it is that's being left out or what in it is fake.
But at the same time, the experiences have to be of things that are different rules than what we think the world works by, but they really are reflections of the way the world really is.
Yeah, because, and I think this is what Lewis is really pointing to, his idea of fantasy. I would hazard a guess that this is not really the way fantasy writers today think about fantasy at all. Because for Lewis, what he's saying is, yes, you're getting a new experience that you can't have while you're entrenched in this life in the fantasy realm, because it has so many details left out. you're in fact having kind of like pure experiences within the fantasy realm. But Lewis then, of course, points back to the fact that, well, you have to be getting those ideas, the things that you're desiring in the fantasy realm from somewhere. And so you'll have to go back and find them in our world. I feel like I lost a little bit of the question.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
That answers it. Thank you. And then one more thing. Can you just talk a little bit about that interesting sentence, that night my imagination was in a certain sense baptized?
Yes, because I forgot to do that during the actual oration. Yes, the imagination is a faculty that is most bound up in the retention of your experience with reality. But we know that our experiences, as they build up over time, are also essentially the way we come to view the world. Our experiences have such an importance that, depending on what they are and the way that we view them, the way that we interact with them, partly through like memory, or just taking the images and then like thinking about them really hard and having emotional responses to them, are going to necessarily affect the way we view the world as a whole and the way we view new images that come to us. So what Lewis is pointing to here is the fact that this bright shadow, his interaction with George MacDonald's world, is actually changing the way he's beginning to see the world and being able to change the way he's viewing his experience of it, which then will later allow him to basically be the guy who says, I live in a world of God and goddesses. That is a reality that I am experiencing, that I can now see when I couldn't before, even though it was always there.
Yeah. Can you say a little more? Why is that a baptism?
Well,
It's a change, but why a baptism?
Well, because a baptism is a bringing forth of new life. But we also know that for us, the word baptism is also charged with the idea that it is supernatural. And most especially, it's a kind of idea of bringing what was there before, and you're not ending it. You're not just starting something new, but you're taking what was already somehow at work, in this case, the imagination, and bringing it into a greater fullness of its actual end. So, for instance, with the imagination, Lewis thinks that his imagination was retaining reality because before he came in contact with George MacDonald, he had a very materialistic view of reality, that his imagination was just taking material things and then plopping them somewhere else, for instance, in the fantasy genre. But he only saw his imagination as retaining material existences. But if the imagination is necessarily intent upon actually retaining reality as it is presented to you, then reality doesn't just present material significance to you. You might not be able to see it, but all the things that you interact with are speaking to you of something else, just like most particularly Lewis goes into with the objects of enchantment.
And just a little follow-up, would it be fair to say that his imagination is made Christian by saying it's baptized, or is that too far? Is that not what he really means there?
The quote does end with the fact that the rest of him necessarily became like reconverted later. I don't remember the exact wordings of it. I don't think that it necessarily means he became Christian, because we could see how he could stop in a way at his imagination being baptized and being like, oh, there's something else that's pointing me towards, but never actually getting to the something else. I think that if you're actually pursuing the ends that he sees in like his imagination being baptized, you will come upon Christianity. But I don't think it's like necessary that you do. You could kind of stop halfway and just be like, wow, the world has a meaning to it, and be content with that. But obviously Lewis goes much farther.
I was just thinking about at least the stories that I'm familiar with Lewis, say the Narnia stories, or the space trilogy, which is maybe not what you're thinking about as much. But it strikes me that they're sort of realistic. They're actually, the children start in a normal place and then they have to go into Narnia.
Mm-hmm.
In the Land, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or in the Magician's Nephew, there's a mechanism by which they go into the wood between the worlds, and then when they're in Narnia, it's not really a fake place. It's actually sort of the same world. It's just that things are named differently. So like, it doesn't seem as detached from our world as a lot of,
Middle Earth or something.
yeah, say Middle Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a decision that Lewis has made? That, I mean, do you think he would reject some kinds of fantasy as being too disconnected from the world because they make, like you could have a good God who's just not Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
but Lewis seems to want to make Jesus just make him a lion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, yeah, it's very closely tied to our own thing. It's, yeah. Could you say a little bit? I mean, is there a way that fantasy because you were talking about how there has to be something other about the world, but also the same. Does he think that that's the kind of thing that has to be the same for fantasy to be good? Like to have the same God ruling in it? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So would he reject something like, I mean, you probably know what he said about this, but would he just outright reject something like Middle Earth?
No. I don't think, for one, just from Lewis's own writings, that it's necessary that the fantastic or the mythical has to do with like having some similarity to ours in like particularly like the Christian way. I would point to even Till We Have Faces, where you have he of course is starting from a myth that is pre-Christianity, and then so it's far outside of our experience, and he takes it, and even when he enmeshes it with a great deal more detail and feeling and like kind of like reality to the story, he points towards the idea of like the gods being different than the main characters expect, but he doesn't actually come out and say like, actually this is just a kind of like an Aslan character kind of thing. So I don't think he's necessarily pointing to the fact that that has to be a structure within a fantasy realm, like that has to at least stay the same for it to be good fantasy. In particularly taking into consideration Tolkien, I think Tolkien and Lewis are just doing very different things within the fantastic mode. Tolkien, of course, he began so much of his story because he had a language that he wanted to create a world for. And so Middle Earth sparks from there. Whereas I think what Lewis is doing in his fantasy is he's particularly looking at the idea that our world and the fantasy world are necessarily enmeshed. And he wants to more clearly show that to his readers. And that's why the Chronicles of Narnia looks like it does. I think many of the same things could still be said, for instance, of Tolkien's world, that it in many ways is leaving out irrelevancies and it's just trying to give you more of a progression of experience, even though it seems like it's still mostly detached from our world because it literally takes place with no connection from our world. But I don't think that he sees this as a bad thing. I think he's just intentionally trying to do something different with his fantasy than Tolkien is.
Could you say a little bit about what might separate good fantasy from bad fantasy?
Yeah.
The stories you were remembering in your childhood are probably, many of them are very different from what Lewis does, right? Like they are maybe a place where you there's no connection to this world, or at least the connection is much more tenuous. And the heroes are not the heroes of this world dressed up in different costumes or something. There's a likeness, but they're not, I don't know. So I suppose you can have bad fantasy too, right? So if there can be so much variety in this, what is it that separates the good from the bad? That's a simplistic question. This is maybe not going to be one thing, but maybe you could sketch out some possible answers to that. I
think the more fantasy, like if you have kind of, Lewis seems like he's a really beautiful medium where he's building up the connection between our world and the fantastic realm. But then I think as you go more and more into just fantasy, the fantastic that has no relation to our world, it becomes harder to see that connection that Lewis is pointing towards. But that's not really a fault or like a bad thing about the fantasy. I think you would just have to become really good at recognizing first Lewis's point that somehow that world is trying to tell us something about our world and like can somehow be found here. and therefore know which parts you can kind of like translate over. But that gets harder as like it kind of gets like, in a way, there's some very like ostentatious fantasy where they don't seem at all to be concerned with like making you think that this world could be one you could live in. I mean, that's kind of hard to do, but it's kind of like if they focus all the attention on the fact that their fantasy realm is not like this world, then that's probably a sign that they're not going to be very good fantasy, because it's kind of severing a connection that is necessary for what fantasy is.
Does good fantasy always have to be didactic? What I mean is, it seems like a lot of people think of, say, novels as being you represent the world and you try to be faithful to the way the world is, but you're not trying to teach people something exactly. And in fact, if you did try to teach something with the novel in a kind of overt, ham-handed way, you would ruin the novel. Whereas it seems like in fantasy, there's an overt attempt to teach people something. It seems very different from. Is that right?
I don't think.
Like if I wrote a fantasy novel, I got princesses, there's frogs, people kissing frogs, you got all the stuff you need, and at the end, it just like things just kind of fall apart and everyone's unhappy. And that's the way it is. It doesn't seem like it's succeeded as a fantasy story. I don't know.
Well, I suppose there it would call into question the fact of like the fairy tale story is not necessarily trying to like give you the idea that there's always a happily ever after to like every story. I mean, there are plenty of fairy tales that end in very like gruesome, sad, and unpleasant ways. But if the fairy tale, as Lewis, the fantastic, and within that, the fairy tale, is more bent on giving you like a progression of experiences within the story with the greatest kind of clarity, then I think that kind of points to the fact that sure, it's easy to kind of like point at fairy tales in particular and maybe the broader fantasy genre and be like, look at, they're trying to moralize at us. But in a way, it's only because it's so simple compared to our world, because we don't feel as if there's a bunch of things coming up and telling us, like, for instance, in a Russian novel where you have, if one character says one thing, there's probably going to be another character that says the exact opposite. And then there's one in the middle who like veers from side to side. And so you don't really get the idea that you're being moralized at because it's so confusing what everyone else is trying to tell you. But in the fairy tale, you have a different thing where the story structure is so simple and there aren't really like opposing view sides, except for instance, the dragon who wants to eat the princess and the knight who wants to save her. And you're like, maybe that seems like it's moralizing at you too much, but it's like, there's just not a lot of other clutter to take up that space and confuse you. So you're left with the option of, do I want the knight to save the princess or do I want her to get eaten by a dragon? And that seems pretty obvious to us which one we're going to go for. So it can feel as if we're just being fed a simple moral, when really we're just kind of being given a version of reality in which we don't really have to be confused. We can just look at the things presented to us and make a split-second decision about which one we think is right. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I followed all of it. I was partially listening to you and partially thinking about something related to what you were saying. Sorry, so maybe you have to say that again. Maybe, but I was thinking about how people talk about stories being true, even though they're stories. There's something like people might say that the Brothers K is true. It's true somehow, but it's not stuff that actually happened. Mm-hmm. Is that the same? Is that also a requirement for fantasy?
Yeah, for Lewis at least, definitely. I mean, in his book Miracles, he has just this entire progression of the idea of the mythic or the myth being more true than reality. And he kind of compares, he like says it's analogous to the way that God is more true than this reality, even though we only come in contact with God like through this reality.
Yeah. And what does that mean to say that the Princess and the Dragon is more true than this reality?
it feels kind of dangerous to go into the idea that they're more true insofar as they are just much more simple representations of reality. And so we know that that God being the simplest, there are just like simple things that like are and are not true. And so when we get the princess and the dragon, what is essentially being pointed to in the fairy tale is that somehow the way that these things interact with each other, the way that you experience them, to have a more fullness of reality that they're able to come in contact with than perhaps what you seem to go through in your day-to-day life. And I think that might actually just be because they are the more simplistic view of reality that you can actually think of and judge much more for exactly how they're presented than all the things that will confuse them otherwise. Does that make sense?
Maybe kind of sort of tagging in the same line. You talked about Lewis. Somebody mentioned Tolkien. Chesterton wrote some fantasies. George MacDonald, of course. These are all Christians. Does what you have to say, or does what Lewis has to say, does that apply beyond? Does it apply to, I don't know, Star Wars strikes me as more of a fairy tale than science fiction, but does it apply to Harry Potter?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, how?
I think it definitely does, and we can see that in kind of like there are a lot of very popular like fantasy stories. For instance, Harry Potter, or I could think of like 3 different Brandon Sanderson stories, or Star Wars, that you can see that the tendency towards simplicity is kind of sometimes what can set them apart. I would say that especially the first like 3 Star Wars films are much more fantasy, but they're also much more simple. They are giving you the ideas of good versus evil. I mean, the hero is literally called a Jedi Knight, and it's kind of like leaning into the simplistic fantasy that's just giving you like a progression of experience and characters interacting with each other to kind of see how all these ideas will play out. It gets with like Harry Potter. I haven't read the books, but I have watched most of the movies. I think we also kind of see that play out here. And I think in some ways, Harry Potter is like a much more secular way of like bringing in some of the dynamics that Lewis is also bringing in, which is the idea of our world going into magic world. But she does something different. And I'm not sure if this is just showing her to be like Rawlings does something different. And I'm not sure if this is showcasing that what she's trying to get at in fantasy is just not what Lewis sees fantasy as tending towards. But she has a propensity to say, you should just go into the magic world. The magic world is better. There's nothing like, if you have magic, that's great, because now you don't have to live literally like the people they call muggles. And then like, you can't live in the magical world anymore. And that would really stink. And so she seems, at least with her idea of fantasy, as kind of this idea of separating our world from the kind of fantastic realm necessarily. And I guess I'm not sure, like, it seems to me that because so many of the people that were like, that Lewis, or so many of the people that you mentioned, these like Christian fantasy writers, that they seem very bound up in trying to connect the 2 worlds together. And I'm not sure if that's inherent in fantasy according to Lewis's view, or if it's just the natural like Christian response when you come in contact with the goods in fantasy and you want to somehow draw them back.
Thank you. Questions from the audience?
Kyla.
Thank you so much. As you already know, I really love this topic. It seems to me we're kind of muddling the difference between fantasy and fairy tales. And to me, they seem like different things. Novels about fantasy seem to be a little bit more complex than just fairy tales. And I guess I have the idea that the good thing about fairy tales is they help us to love good things and to hate bad things. And I'm wondering if that's a good way to tell the difference between a good and bad fairy tale, is if it helps, or even any story, is if it helps us love good things and hate bad things, or if it does the other, or if it goes the other way. And if what do you think about that?
About whether or not that's the
A good way to judge whether or not it's a good story or a good fairy tale.
Well, I think that is a way to kind of judge almost any story, not particularly to fairy tales, even though it's easy within the fairy tale because, kind of like I said, the simplicity of the dynamics between the characters. I would say that, like, if it like that seems like it kind of is a really good thing to look at all works of story. But in speaking to like the wider fantasy genre and fairy tales, I think that at least for Lewis, the fairy tales are deeply embedded into the fantastic. But I think a lot of the confusion about like why it's kind of hard to take everything Lewis is seeing in the fantastic and kind of translating it to the modern world is the fact that there has been a lot of muddling in like what fantasy is supposed to do. And so now fantasy in some ways is just kind of like you take basically a thing that is totally recognizable as a thing that happens in our world, for instance, like the confusion or the complexities of this life, and then you just put it somewhere where like things look slightly different. But people are like, oh, well, that's fantasy because it's like there's, it happens like in the sky versus on the ground, and so like now we can say that this is like something different. When really they're kind of just trying to take kind of like the dressings of the fantastic and put them on something when really they just kind of want to talk about this immediately as it happens and as they experience it. So yeah, it does kind of like get muddled between the fantasy novel because it's not really trying to do the fairy tale thing, but the fairy tale is kind of where all, in Lewis's estimation, like all fantasy is starting from.
How is it not doing the fairy tale thing? It seems like it is doing the fairy tale thing. I thought you were saying earlier that what the fairy tale does is it allows you to see, maybe I'm imposing this thesis on you, maybe you can say this, but the fairy tale allows you to sort of like see the world as it really is again, because it's fresh and different and new. Is that not what those other fantasies do?
Not for a majority of them, because it doesn't really take like the goods it see in this world and present them to you with greater clarity. It just kind of takes this world and with kind of like how you experience it exactly. Like you're still, instead of like bringing more clearly into view the goods that are in this world, and like that's where Lewis's idea of kind of like escaping into the fantasy, because you have to like see things more clearly there, so that you can return and find those things again here. Whereas I feel like what a great deal of modern fantasy in the fantasy stories do is they basically just take their experience exactly how it is in this world and they just plop it down in like another world, as if the fact that it's in another world is all that the fantasy entailed. Lewis is pointing to the fact that it's not just the fact that it is in some kind of reality that's some way slightly different from ours, but like that there's an essential difference in how that world is being represented to us, not kind of really as our own, because then the things that we have a hard time experiencing here can be seen more clearly there. So for instance, my mind mostly works really well in like comparisons. For instance, if you take like Tolkien's world with where you think there's a lot of realistic things in that, but then you take, for instance, the Game of Thrones world, which I have not read, just so you all know. And you like do studies on it and you get passages and you're like, this one is lauded for being like a fantasy world, but it's also lauded as being hyper realistic. And what that means for them is that it's really sexual, it's really violent. And they're like, but it's fantasy because it takes place somewhere else. But what Lewis is pointing to is the fact that fantasy is supposed to, in fact, take you away from all the things that make life seem horrible, that make life unclear and confused. And it's supposed to extradite them to another place. Because for you, for the reader's mind, those things can't really seem to exist here. Look at how terrible it is. But then you do something like Tolkien and you push off the details of kind of like the daily run-of-the-mill life or like all the horrible things, and you make them much more clearly pointed, where you're like, okay, here are the forces of good, here are the forces of evil. They're going to be fighting, and like that's our main concern right now.
Sorry, I didn't want to.
That's okay.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Oh. Oh, I guess I should. Sorry, I always forget the handshake part.
Thank you.